Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or good morning to some of our participants from the other side of the ocean. My name is Christian Fischer, and I am the director of DIIS, the Danish Institute for International Studies. And it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this event. It is, in fact, the first event in a series of seminars that we are having in the next few months, focusing on gender and insecurity. The seminar series invites discussion on how gender insecurity comes about and on how gender is mobilized for change over a wide range of core political issues, such as peace, political extremism, migration, surveillance, and mobilization. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to postpone public seminars to the autumn. Today's webinar, nevertheless, kicks off the series of events with Professor Cecilia Menivar's talk on gender and multi-sided violence in Central America and elsewhere. Other themes for the seminar series include the rise of anti-feminism, gendered form of migrant smuggling, gender conflict and peace building, gender security and right-wing extremism, and also how to mobilize gendered violence. The seminar series is a multidisciplinary initiative taken across the 5 research units at DIIS. Around 10 of our researchers have contributed to inform the series, and by inviting international experts to dialogue on these important themes. The seminar series is coordinated by senior researchers Robin May Scott and Nina Nyberg Sørensen, whom you will meet in a minute. We are very happy that so many people have decided to join us today. I look very much forward to listening to Professor Menivar's talk and the following discussion. And with these words of welcome, I wish you all a fruitful webinar and give the word to Nina, who is today's host. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. I too want to welcome especially Cecilia Menivar, of course, our guest speaker, but also participants from actually many countries, which is the advantage of doing this as a webinar and not a physical seminar. So welcome to participants from Copenhagen, from Denmark, from Europe, from the United States, from several Latin American countries, Eastern Europe, and also welcome to people from various national and international organizations working with these issues. It's a great pleasure to have you here. This is the first webinar I host. I participated in some, so I'm actually sitting in my kitchen. This background is where DIIS is located, but I'm sitting in my kitchen working from home. We will be aided today technically by Trine Rosenberg, who is our conference boss at DIIS, who is steering the techniques. We will also have the assistance of Emma Andersen, who's a student assistant in my department. And due to the high number of participants, we will ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and type in your comments and questions during Cecilia's talk. We will then have a debate afterwards based on that, but we will not be able to let you all have a microphone. That being said, let me introduce today's speaker. Cecilia Menivar is a professor and Dorothy Meyer Social Equities Chair at the Department of Sociology at the University of California in Los Angeles. And her work focuses on the structural roots of inequalities and on how individual social locations shape their responses to such conditions. The theoretical strands that connect her research centers on the state and its actions, how state power, for instance, manifests through legal regimes, bureaucracies, and formal institutions in the micro-processes of everyday life in various contexts. This thread links her two empirical areas of work. One is the judicial system failures that sustain gender-based violence in Central America in particular, and context. The other one is context that immigrants encounter mostly in the United States. She has published widely on these issues, and I cannot mention all her publications, but in the seminar invitation, there was a link to Cecilia's homepage, and you can visit it there and see her publications. But I would like to mention her 2011 book called Enduring Violence, Latina Women's Lives in Guatemala, that was published in Berkeley by University of California Press, because part of that book is also the background of today's speak. And we will show you a picture of the book in a little while. I could also mention a book she edited with Leslie Abrego on immigrant families that came out at Cambridge, UK Policy Press. There are several journal articles, there are several book chapters. I will only mention that Cecilia co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Migration Crisis that came out last year, which is a very good book that takes you around all the crises that are evoked by the term migration, especially in policy circles. This weekend, Cecilia was elected president of the American Sociological Association, so I am extremely pleased that you have the time to be with us and talk to us today about gender and multi-sided violence in Central America and beyond. So please go ahead, Cecilia. We look forward to listening to you.
Thank you so much, Nina, for that warm introduction, and also to Christian. And for the opportunity to share my work with all of you. I wished I could have been there in person, but I'm happy to be there through this medium, because as you said, it allows us to connect much more broadly. And so I'm very, very happy, and thank you so much for the invitation. Me too, I'm at home. The background you see right now is my office on campus at UCLA, which I was telling Nina I haven't seen since mid-March. So I'm missing my office right now, where I would normally be meeting with students, but such the case now. So thank you for inviting me to talk about this very long-term interest of mine that I wrote a book about the different forms of violence that women experience in their everyday lives that are not confined only to physical aggression. And this has been an effort of mine intellectually and practically as well, to call attention to the variety, the wide range of sources of violence that impinge on women's lives every day in their private and public lives across a multiplicity of spaces. And so I'm going to be sharing some of those thoughts with you today. So,
I would very much like you to elaborate on these different forms of violence that are prevalent in the Central American region.
Yes, very briefly, what I try to do in my work, and this is not just simply an intellectual interest of mine. When I did the research, I did ethnographic field research for the book you mentioned that I wrote on enduring violence, and I titled it Enduring Violence, to capture the always present violence in women's everyday lives in Guatemala, excuse me, but also the sense of being there all the time. So that was my goal there. But when, very briefly, and we can talk about this later, when I started doing this work, I wanted to capture women's networks, informal networks. And what happens is that in the course of my research, women started to share stories of suffering, of pain, and of what they were experiencing, what I later titled women's private terrors, because they very seldom talk about those experiences as violence. So I wanted to capture them with this lens of violence. And so in my work, I stay away from analyzing the violence only as a form of aggression, which implies an individual harming another with intention. In my work, I turn the lens around, and in addition to capturing those moments of physical violence, I make it a central piece to capture forms of structural inequalities that come from neoliberal policies that exacerbate inequalities and make women, the majority of women, more vulnerable to policies, to neoliberal policies. I also try to capture prevalent gender ideologies and expectations of behavior, everyday humiliations in the lives of women, social marginalization that comes from race, ethnicity, and social class that exacerbates vulnerabilities for Afro-descendant women, for indigenous Mayas, and for the poor, which are the overwhelming majority of women in Guatemala, but also in the region that I specialize in. And adding to this, the generalized violence of a so-called post-conflict society that are actually more violent now than during the civil wars and during the conflicts of 20, 30 years ago, that have left a legacy of a militarized mindset, a militarized way of life, and that are actually the roots of the violence we tend to associate with violence in Central America, which comes in the form of gangs and cartels and these other forms that are very much connected to the militarization of life during the civil wars, in my view. Mm. Those are the multiple forms of violence that I try to capture, which I comprise in a lens of multi-sided violence.
Very interesting. So in which context, Cecilia, would that violence typically be carried out?
So because it is not, this violence is, I see it as all encompassing. It encompasses, of course, physical forms, but also non-physical, psychological forms of violence, which happen every day, harassment, exploitation in the workplace, but exploitation in other spheres of life. It comes from individuals, of course, because very often violence is manifested in individuals, but it comes from groups in society, from institutions, and from the state. And that's a very important piece of my work, that all these forms of violence are very much connected. The state, through institutions, through laws and policies, inflicts multiple forms of violence in the lives of women, policies that displace them from traditional forms of earning a living, for instance, policies that ignore their plight when they are seeking protection from more direct forms of violence. In all these forms coalesce in women's lives in ways that make it normalize their experiences. And so in my work, I focus very much on the everyday life, the routine forms of physical, psychological, emotional violence that are understood by the women as the way things are. These are not things, it's not that they don't recognize the suffering that they create. It is that these are understood as part of the things, the way things are. Focus on this aspect of routinized violence that in my work, I think, I argue, pave the way for the more egregious forms of violence in the forms of killings of women.
Yeah.
Once the lives of women are devalued and excluded socially in multiple ways, it paves the way for more egregious forms of violence.
Of course, violence against women is against the law in many places in Central America as well. But when it comes to violence, gender-based violence, which international frameworks exist?
Yes, there are several international frameworks, and all the countries that I have worked with on, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, have integrated in their laws a version of international frameworks. For instance, I start out with the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Article 1, for the purposes of this declaration, the term violence against women means any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats or such acts or similar acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. So it's a very capacious definition that captures precisely the work that I'm trying to, the aspects of women's lives and violence in their lives that I'm trying to capture in my work. So these international agreements are not limited to physical violence. It includes the various forms that I'm trying to capture in my work, which is part of the lens that I try to promote as we examine gender-based violence in the lives of women. That is not just an individual act of aggression that can be eradicated with solutions focused on individuals. Yes, there are several international agreements and frameworks that countries have drawn from to eradicate this.
So maybe you can tell us a bit about then how the situation is in the different Central American countries.
So from that book that where I describe and I pay attention to the everyday forms of violence and the devaluation of women's lives that women experience every day, the conclusion of that book, I explain that this paves the way for crimes against women to be committed. And so after that book, I've been working specifically on feminicide and the killings of women, and more specifically, how violence against women continues to be perpetrated. So feminicide in Central America, it was well known to be quite high. For instance, just in the past 3 years of data, 2016 to 2018, about 2,000 women were killed in Guatemala, about 1,500 women were killed in El Salvador, and about 1,600 women were killed in Honduras. And people have this is a comment I get often, but more men are killed in the violence of Central America. of course, more men are killed. Actually, many more men are killed in the violence of Central America. But there is a qualitative difference that sets the killings of women apart. In the words of Gabriela Torres, the Guatemalan anthropologist, women are not just killed like men, they are overkilled, meaning there usually are signs of torture, of killing, and killing on top of that, of killing with a bullet or dismembering, but multiple things, burnings. So it's not, so to us, that conveys another level, a different level. It conveys the anger, the aggression that comes encapsulated in this overkilling, the overkilling of women, not just killing. Men tend to be killed by a bullet, by someone often unknown, but women actually get killed by people they know, and they are overkilled. So that's the situation there.
Yeah. So how are the national governments in Central America responding to this crisis of gender-based violence and femicide?
All these countries have passed multiple laws, Guatemala, the three countries have passed close to 50 laws between 1960 and 2018 to address violence against women in different forms. Guatemala just recently passed 4 laws, for instance, the National Plan for the Prevention and Eradication of Intrafamily Violence and Violence Against Women, the law to prevent the sanctions and to eradicate violence within the family, the law for the dignification and integral promotion of women, the law against femicide and other forms of violence against women, and the other countries have similar laws. So all these countries have a significant body of laws in the books that are supposed to protect women from violence.
Yeah.
Yet, we see that the killings of women continue. Violence against women continues without decreasing at all, in spite of the violence, in spite of the laws.
Mm-hmm. I know that gender-based violence in Central America has led to asylum in the US and elsewhere. How has your research played a role in this? Or more broadly, what is the connection, maybe I can ask, what is the connection between research and asylum case procedures?
Yes, so after when there was an increase in the migration of women seeking asylum, seeking protection, migrating from Central America to mostly the United States, seeking asylum on the grounds of gender-based violence in their countries, I started to be involved with lawyers, organizations, helping women to file their cases, and that prompted me to research why, in spite of all these laws, women were still being killed and were fleeing in large proportion now, seeking asylum in other countries to protect themselves. And the stories the women seeking asylum share are harrowing. And so I wanted to see why. And with a political scientist colleague, Shannon Drysdale-Walsh, we started to look into this gap between the laws in the books and laws in action and why that happens. And so what we did is we wrote and articles for each country, for Guatemala, for El Salvador, for Honduras, and for the 3 countries. And so what we have done is we have used that research that looks at the failures of the justice systems in those countries, the why laws in the books are not implemented, why the police, for instance, are so indifferent to the plight of women, why, for instance, in a Guatemalan case we have in one of our articles, the families of two women who were killed have to beg, have to ask for the police to please investigate the case. They have witness, they can provide witness, they can, and the police are completely indifferent. And so we wanted to find out why. So that then we have used this research in support of the cases of asylum seekers, of women seeking asylum from Central America in the United States. And so in that body of work, we have tried to explain that this is not a machista culture. This is not the result of individuals just harming women because they are women. We have tried to highlight the active role of the state in ignoring the plights of women, but also sometimes more directly creating conditions of violence for women to experience violence. So that's how I have connected this work with what the legal community is the legal community that supports asylum seekers from women asylum seekers from Central America are trying to do. Mm-hmm. And that is because there's so many women seeking protection from Central America in the United States. It's a constant form of work for me, because I provide that scientific backing for their claims.
Yeah, I see. That experience from Central America is probably also relevant elsewhere in the world. I mean, beyond the Central American case, there are many countries. Have you dealt with more international issues?
No, I have not in my own research, but I have had multiple conversations with colleagues from around the world where the situation is so similar. And in some of our writings, we have made it a point to connect, for instance, killings of women in India, killings of women in the Philippines, killings of women throughout the globe, even killings of women in the United States. Native American women are being disappeared and killed at an alarming rate. And so I actually have a paper where I connect where I use this lens of multi-sided violence to examine the violence that African American and poor women in the United States also experience, because it's very much connected to state actions, to policies that it's not that they don't help women, it's that structurally position women in such vulnerable situations that they are very much they are made vulnerable to experience gender-based violence. Yeah. So I have connected as much as possible the work that I have done in Central America to other regions of the world, and not ignoring what happens in the United States as well.
Yeah. I have myself wondered how come that women have organized against violence. These countries have, the Central American countries have received tremendous amounts of international aid to change their legal systems, to build NGOs or to support NGOs that are already there. I know that the Mexican state, where violence against women is also very widespread, do South-South cooperation, where they aid Central American countries and Uruguay and some other Latin American countries with setting up legislation or progressive legislation that takes into account women's rights and make systems to punish feminicide hard, but with very little effect. Why is that, do you think?
We argue that when these laws are passed in a vacuum of other efforts, when in NGOs are created, when governments receive resources to eradicate violence in the lives of women, but nothing else changes, none of these efforts are going to be effective. When, for instance, in one of the papers we published, we found that Guatemala, for instance, and the same applies to the other two countries. They pass all these laws, multiple laws, almost 50 laws among the three countries, but other what we call adjacent laws don't change. So, for instance, laws that govern divorce, property rights, alimony, land tenure systems, they still favor men. They still, those still are so lopsided and unbalanced. And it's not, of course, legal to discriminate formally against women in law, but the way the laws are written position women in very vulnerable situations. And so what happens is that when it comes time to enforce gender-based violence laws, very often, and we see these all the way from police officers all the way to judges in the justice systems, what happens is that very often people who are deciding invoke these other laws before they invoke violence against women laws. So we argue that when nothing else changes, violence against women laws are going to be empty and basically symbolic, just to appear as if they're doing something. And policies that still do not change women's lives economically, socially, in terms of access to decent pay and education and you name it, housing, when nothing changes, women will continue to be vulnerable socially and economically, and more vulnerable in amplified forms to gender-based violence in spite of the laws. When ideologies, gender ideologies, and how we think about gender roles, how we think about the position of women in society, and how we value women are still very much entrenched and very much part of everyday life. Those are going to seep through how people in the justice system make decisions and understand women's lives. And so when nothing else changes in terms of laws, in terms of other policies, other laws, just basic gender ideologies, when all of that stays in place, no matter how many laws are passed, no matter how many NGOs work for this change, no matter how much resources these governments receive, nothing will really change. And I think this is the case for other countries as well, not just for the three Central American countries, and certainly Mexico, or the rest of Latin America, which Latin America has some of the highest rates of violence against women, but we know it's not an isolated case.
Yeah. You said earlier in your talk or in our conversation here that among the common explanations for gender-based violence, we find that it's because of the local machista culture or machista state politics, or it could be because of widespread gang violence or the narco cartels. territorial fights over control that become sort of symbolically manifested on women's bodies. You also talked about fragile or non-existent law enforcement practices leading to high rates of impunity. But I also have the sense that you see some limitations in these explanations. So it goes beyond that.
Yes, yes. It goes beyond those explanations, yes. So for instance, as an example, when judges in the United States are evaluating cases of women seeking asylum from Central American women seeking asylum here, judges very often understand much more easily an explanation based on gang violence or machista culture. It's more difficult for us to explain and for the judges to understand. And finally, if the judges understand, it's a winning case. That all of these forms are very much connected, and they have very critical, strong institutional structural basis. And in the States, so one time one judge asked me in court, I was serving as an expert witness in a court case of a woman seeking asylum. And the judge asked me if I thought the government, I think it was El Salvador, was willing and able to protect this woman from violence. So I had to give him an explanation why it is not just her partner committing a violent act. This comes all the way from the state, from government institutions, from how the judicial system works or doesn't work, from employers, how employers see women's salaries as complementary to their partners, to their husbands' earnings. That to me is a form of devaluing the contributions of women, and contributes to portraying them to positioning them in a vulnerable situation. So I went through all the different ways that multiple institutions and other spaces beyond individuals contribute to make women vulnerable to violence, yeah, and protected.
It seems extremely important to take those issues on board, especially when you engage with asylum cases. I'll stop asking you questions in just a little while, but I have a last one because I wanted to ask you, I mean, we have seen that women have mobilized for more than 20, 30 years, starting with Ciudad Juárez in Mexico, and mobilized against gender-based violence, very strong organizations. So mm-hmm. What can the rest of the world learn from these women's experiences?
Yes, and I have to mention that it is the work of women's organizations, of feminist women's organizations, and it is their work that actually has made possible some advances. It is through their work that, for instance, feminicide courts have been created in Guatemala. It is through their work that presidents of El Salvador have mentioned, at least in their speeches, efforts to protect women from violence, even if it's empty. But at least there's a mention now when there was nothing like that before. So I have I couldn't not mention those efforts and the effect they have had. The work is enormous, and because what really is needed is complete societal change in how, excuse me, women are seen, how to start valuing the lives of women, and to start positioning women in a different light. But organizations, women's rights organizations, feminist organizations have done have promoted tremendous advances that wouldn't be there if it wasn't for their efforts, in conjunction with international organizations, international aid that works in coordination with women's organizations in those countries. So at one point, I imagine the governments sandwiched between these two forces, pushing them to do something. And I think that's one way to affect change. But change not only in what we traditionally think will be effective. It's not just change in the justice system. It's change in gender ideologies. It's change that starts with socialization of children in schools. It's change that change.
You are falling out. Are you back? Maybe you, do you have sound, Cecilia?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, all right. So yes, excuse me, I think promoting all those forms of changes in other laws, changes in socializing children to see girls in a different light. All of this requires huge efforts, but it could be done, I think.
Yeah.
The more we know about it, the more we learn.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And I see that we have a very active audience, participants to this seminar, with several very interesting questions coming in. For instance, we have a participant asking if you can explain how the microaggressions lead to more extreme forms of violence. And she adds, of course, no violence is a mirror. No, she doesn't. She says, of course, no violence is minor. Sorry, very small letters on my screen.
I think in my work, I connect these two very strongly. When women are told that they are not good, when women are controlled in their everyday lives, when one quick example, romantic relations are understood in as, to me, very often they look like forms of extreme control of women's lives and bodies, but they are understood as romantic love, the partner controlling every moment of women's lives. That can very easily escalate into physical violence and then more. So those forms of, those microaggressions and everyday experiences, everyday reminders of where women belong are very much connected to these more egregious forms.
Yeah.
And no small forms of, I think we need to understand.
Another participant asks if some women actually got asylum in the US on account of experience of sexual violence. Can you tell about some successful cases?
You know, there are sexual violence in the cases that I have seen very rarely occurs in isolation of other forms of violence. So for instance, a woman experiences sexual violence, but also experiences physical violence and physical violence. And so all of these present a very strong case. And those cases, I have seen some of those cases being successful. We have a very different government in the United States today, and that is manifested in how courts operate, and because policies coming down have made it much more difficult for women to even have the right to present asylum cases. So right now, lawyers tell me that they absolutely need an expert witness to help them with their cases. In the past, it wasn't so much the case. Excuse me, an expert testimony would enhance a case, but it was not needed. But now the requirements have changed so much. Policies have changed so much that, yeah.
Thank you. The first question, I should say, was asked by Katja Madsen, and the second one by Trude Dallerup. Now, Liris Hjelt asked, how do you see the role of the international community in solving the problem or being part of the solution? What could the UN, for instance, do?
You know, the international community can do a lot by continuing to put pressure, but also by, for instance, the UN definition of gender-based violence can easily be applied to a program that eradicates not just the physical violence that we associate with violence, but the microaggressions, the everyday experiences of the devaluation of women's lives. And so I think the international community, has a major role to play. Mm-hmm. Helping the organizations on the ground by working in coordination with them, but also by pressuring governments to change educational systems, for instance, to instill a different set of views of girls, of young women. So the international community actually plays a key role.
Yeah. My former colleague, actually, Sofia Villatoro, asked from Guatemala, or she says that the current government is weakening the institutionality of women, including, now the question disappeared here. Let's see, where did it went? Here it is. I'll resume. The current government is weakening the institutionality of women, including the body that coordinates actions to eradicate violence against women, which is CEPREM and CONAPREVI. What mechanisms can we promote, Sophia asks, from civil society to support women, especially in the midst of the crisis of COVID?
Oh my goodness, yes. That, my goodness, that is adding a major challenge. It's adding another layer. When COVID started, my colleague Shannon Drysdale-Walsh and I had a phone conversation thinking of what this would mean for gender-based violence against women. Because just imagine requiring women to be home all the time. Just imagine that scenario. And we now have some evidence that it is exacerbating conditions for gender-based violence for women. Women have, and I keep on referring to gender-based violence because I don't want to forget that. I could call it domestic violence, but I want to still retain the broader conceptualization. So it has increased. Cases of domestic violence have increased in the context of COVID. And we have I think we have a perfect storm of conditions that can make things even worse, because we also have these governments throughout the region and here, and if you look elsewhere, that are trying to undermine the gains that were made in the past. So on the one hand, we have worsening conditions, worsening economic conditions that imagine the effect that the global economic crisis will have on women. Governmental policies that continue to eradicate the gains that were made. And then we have the pandemic with added challenges. So what I think this is a moment where organizations on the ground need quite a bit of support to be able to bring back some of those gains that were made in the past, because those gains came about from organizations on the ground with support from the outside, from international organizations that put pressure on governments on both sides. Now that needs to be redoubled, I think. And it is an enormous challenge because the crisis that we're living in will hamper those efforts, but I think it is something that to keep in mind as a form of ameliorating some of the effects of the crisis.
Yeah. People are active, very active here with comments and questions. I'll try to group a couple maybe to enable that we have time for you to answer all of the questions. So Christian Fischer, the DIIS director, asks, what would make a substantial change in the three countries? Would it be increasing proportions of women in parliaments, local power institutions, including police and courts, for instance? So that's on the level of countries, but Fabiola Mieres also asked, do you think that the newly passed ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment, the 190, will create a similar change to the Domestic Workers Convention? So what is your view in light of the laws that need reform and the challenges you so well explained, Fabiola Mieres asks. So one is sort of the convention side, and the other is what are the changes that, based on these international frameworks, parliaments, local power institutions, police and courts should make?
Yeah, you know, there are increasing the participation of women in parliament or in political parties alone may not have the effect we expect. It needs to be women who are conscious of this problem. It needs to be women who know what these conditions are, who know what, who can work with organizations on this, not just any women, but women who have an awareness of the situation and who are willing to work with organizations, because I think that's where the work starts, and to pay attention to what the organizations are trying to tell them, what works. So changes in judicial systems are fine, but we already know that there have been, each country that I work in has 5 or 6 laws in the books, and none of them have any effect. So we know that there's a problem that needs to be addressed by looking in conjunction at other institutions, not just the justice system. Police training is very important, but that has to be done well. because if you're going to only tell police officers that this is important, but not provide examples, not actually change their minds and their views, they're not going to take women's complaints seriously. And so the work needs to start in sort of conscientization of all the people who are involved, are in different ways. You may think that it's the connection is so diluted and so indirect that it doesn't matter, but it does. When your teachers, how they teach, how they start to teach gender roles from very early ages, when employers, when church leaders advise women to take suffering as an everyday life part of their lives. So it's not, so the justice system reforms are of course important, but that is not going to be effective if those reforms are conducted in a vacuum of a much broader change. That would change how people see women, how people see the roles and behaviors and the place of women in society, or broadly.
Then moving from state legislation and international organizations to concrete initiatives taken by organizations. Here I have Carmen Kovacevic asking, do you know maybe about some local initiatives inside the countries that you mentioned? So that's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, that others have started to help women or to mitigate this violence?
There are, oh my goodness, there are organizations in the three countries. More so in Guatemala and El Salvador than in Honduras. Honduras needs more organizations in Honduras need quite a bit of support for the work they're doing, but so do organizations in Guatemala, for instance, because the government is actively undermining the gains that were made in the past. And the same in El Salvador. But yes, there are women's organizations on the ground that are sort of a thorn on the government side, because they continuously try to keep these in the radar of policymakers. And so yes, there are several organizations, and I think it is through their work that any gains have been made. And so I advise and I would advocate to strengthen their work, to support their work.
Yeah. So
and to
they work through advocacy efforts.
Yes, and to support their work in a way that they know what is needed, and to support the work that they do without telling them what to do, basically. And I think that's an important distinction for the local organizations. That they know their governments, they know their leaders, and so they have a knowledge that is very key here, and so to support their work, it's really crucial.
Yeah. So I also have a group of questions talking about gender-based violence combined with other forms of discrimination, such as race. You talked about social discrimination, but how about race, taking into consideration that Central America has a large number of indigenous groups, in Guatemala, of course, but also Afro Central American communities, Garifuna. So is there any combinations here? There's another question asking how much the Central American experience relates to the rest of Latin America, South America, also with mixed populations.
Yes, and that's a very important question that I mentioned very briefly in my talk, but I wanted to say more about, because what I have mentioned is multiplied and amplified multiple times for Maya women, for indigenous women throughout the Americas and everywhere in the world. Look at Native American women in the United States, and for other minoritized populations. And so, for instance, just to give you a sense for the countries I know, and this is something else that may answer some of the other questions. The local resources to address these issues are very concentrated in urban areas. And so, for instance, a lot of the population in rural areas tends to be poorer, indigenous, or minoritized in different ways. So the small gains that are made are usually concentrated in the more visible urban centers. So for women who are, for indigenous women who live in rural areas, who are already vulnerable, excuse me, socially and economically, the layers of violence, of symbolic, structural, gender violence, institutional violence are multiple. And I think that's a major, excuse me, that presents even more challenges. But we need to be cognizant, we need to recognize, and we need to include that angle in efforts that we develop. Not to forget rural areas, and not to forget efforts to do work away from the urban centers. The resources are so tiny that it's very difficult to spread them out, but that's where they're needed. For instance, Honduras only had two shelters for women seeking protection from domestic violence, and they were both concentrated, excuse me, in Tegucigalpa, in the metro, San Pedro Sula, Tegucigalpa area. But just imagine the dearth of resources, and the few resources are concentrated in the capital city metropolitan area, and the same applies to most places. So what I mentioned today is multiplied and amplified for women who live in rural areas, for indigenous women who tend to also live in more marginalized conditions, and for, in general, for minoritized populations.
Thank you, Cecilia. I have seen a Plambek asking two different countries. One relates to your work with Asylum in the US, and she asked, what is your experience on relating and explaining these more structural forms of complex and domestic forms of violence as an expert witness? Does it lead to asylum rather than using sort of the focus on individual perpetrators and this individual case?
I think I could make it easier in my declarations, and just say, oh yeah, these women come from machista culture, men are terrible, and everybody this will register very easily with the lawyers, with the government officials. It would be easy, because then you also see gang violence, men killings, and so it would make it quite easy. But as a sociologist, as someone who studies this, I cannot go for that easy explanation. And actually, I have turned down. I do all this pro bono. I don't get paid for any of this. This is just my opportunity to put academic research to use. That's how I see my participation in these expert witnessing cases that I've been doing. So maybe because of how I see my work, I want to also educate people. And actually one judge, and I say that because one judge told me this is early on, about 5 years ago. The judge took an interest in my explanation, and he asked me more questions. And at the end, he thanked me, and he said, "Thank you for educating me. I did not know any of this." So, so some cases are going to, so there have been successful cases based on, that have used my declarations. And I don't know what would be the case if I used another explanation. I know that I'm not the only one who does this work in the United States. And so I think other colleagues may use other explanations, and their cases may also be successful. But I see this as an opportunity to educate people and to base on the work that I do. And so I want these moments of declarations of accessing to accessing courts to inform the lawyers and the judges about the conditions, the broader conditions women face, the unwillingness and inability of governments to protect them. So yes, I think there have been some success. Yes, we have had successful cases based on my explanation, and but I think other experts use other explanations, and they have also been successful.
Yeah. Now you have come to your work through research, and I have Ida Marie Savio-Wammen asking 2 questions here. So what are the key questions we as researchers need to ask to pay more attention not only to physical and psychological violence, but also the everyday and routinized forms of violence? So which questions should we ask? But the second question is, what kind of theoretical thoughts have you been drawing upon when you have unpacked this all-encompassing violence in Central America?
Yes, I thank you. Yes, that's a very important question. As I share my work with you, the questions that should be asked, I think, have to take into account. If you just use the UN Declaration on the eradication of violence against women, and you include all the different forms that they have listed that go beyond individual forms of aggression, I think keeping those in your research agenda will go a long way to placing in context experiences of domestic violence, for instance. Explaining why laws don't work on the ground. So I think those are questions that would be a source of research questions. And in my case, I started out the research in Guatemala as as a project on women's informal networks and how they relied on informal sources of support to access medical treatments, actually, during pregnancy and for the healthcare of their children. So that was the project I was participating in. But as I did that, in an ethnography, this often happens. You find things, you discover things in the field. And so I started to listen to women, paying close attention to what they were telling me, not only what I was asking, and what I was interested in. And so I started to pay close attention to how they described their lives, how they explained their lives, and how I saw it too, because I lived in those towns where I was doing research. And I started to look for a literature that could help me make sense of these stories, of these narratives that I was gathering. And I found that, and I think it's because that Latin American sociologists provided me with an understanding. For instance, the social psychologist from Latin America, sociologist, the writings of the Jesuit priests who were killed who were assassinated in El Salvador, on the militarization of life, on the militarization of the mind, helped me quite a bit to understand what I was confronting. Also, I started to draw from critical medical anthropologists and critical anthropologists from other parts of the world as well. DIIS work, Kleiman, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, Philippe Bourgois, a group of scholars who use a critical lens and place these the everyday forms of violence as a continuum in a very different, with a very different lens than just simply aggressions at the individual level. So I started to draw from the work of Latin Americans because I think they have a different lens to understand these conditions. The work of sociologists and social thinkers from other parts of the world, especially India, with the work of DIIS and others, and the work of critical anthropologists who work in the United States but work elsewhere in the world. And so they provided me with analytical tools, theoretical tools to understand what I was looking at.
Luckily, some of your articles are open access, so I can only encourage people to Google you and go for those articles that you can access online. And I'm pretty sure that many of the references you are mentioning here are stated in these articles.
Yes.
Time is running. We will have to stop very shortly. But not without asking the $500 question that is, where do you see feminism in Latin America right now? Where do you see the issue of gendered violence right now? Is it increasing? Is it perhaps getting a bit better? But feminism, what is the struggle of men and women against these forms of violence and other forms of discrimination? Where do you see that struggle standing right now?
It is a $500 question, definitely. I want to emphasize that this is not a women versus men struggle, because there are many men who are very conscious and who have taken part in in working with women's groups, in being advocates and working very directly with them. So it's in the struggle and in trying to make change. It's not women versus men. And I think that is a major advance to have men with feminist views promote change and explain and be very active and work actively side by side with feminists. Excuse me. So I think that makes things more complex and more less of these binaries that have sometimes plagued thinking. And so feminism in Latin America, it's a very broad topic, but of course there have been changes, and the participation of indigenous women. For instance, I have the student whose thesis I just coincidentally approved today, is on the various feminisms in Guatemala. And she went to interview Guatemalan feminists from different perspectives, all of them Guatemalan feminists, but they come from different ethnic identities in Guatemala. And it's a very rich thesis that she wrote. She's an undergraduate. But the contribution that comes from multiple forms of knowledge to inform the feminist views and feminist work, I think is what has made some change possible and has contributed to enrich how we see gender-based violence. Women of different races and ethnicities will see it different ways. Feminists who have those knowledges will see it differently as well, and we have to draw from those sorts of knowledge to be able to have something that actually can work.
We could talk all night long,
yes.
All morning long for you. Unfortunately, time is up. It's been very interesting to have this conversation. Thank you so much, Cecilia Menjivar, for taking time to be with us during this webinar. Thank you very much to all the participants for signing up and joining us during the meeting. I should say that stay tuned to the DIIS homepage for the coming seminars. They will be announced shortly. Most will take place after the summer break, and hopefully some of them will be public seminars, but I actually do see the advantage also in having webinars with a much more international participation. So thank you very much for being here with us. It's been a great pleasure to host this seminar.
Thank you so very much for inviting me, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia.